In the Red Sea, December 2023, a single grainy FLIR feed captured something the Pentagon spent decades trying to avoid. A Houthi attack craft built from off-the-shelf parts costing less than a used sedan closes on a US destroyer. The ship answers. A multi-million-dollar interceptor leaves the rail, vaporizing the boat in seconds. Tactically, it's a flawless kill. Strategically, it's a disaster the Navy has been quietly bleeding from for 2 years. Because every time the US Navy wins one of these exchanges, it loses the only metric that actually matters in a long war: the budget. The math is brutal. A speedboat costs roughly $50,000. The missiles burning them down cost between $4 and $5 million apiece. That's a 100-to-1 cost ratio, and it has nothing to do with the boats. It's a structural mismatch. The Navy is fighting an asymmetric war with the wrong tools, and the cheapest, most obvious solution has been sitting on Davis-Monthan aprons for 50 years. Since November 2023, the Houthis have launched over 150 attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab Strait. Their primary tools aren't sophisticated. Modified Iranian-built fast attack craft, Shahed-style one-way drones, and shore-launched anti-ship cruise missiles. Most of those platforms run on commercial components. The boats average 30 to 50 knots and rarely cost more than a small house. What makes them dangerous isn't the platform, it's the tactic. Swarming. A swarm forces the defending warship into arithmetic. Multiple low-cost, low-signature targets approaching from multiple bearings, all under the radar horizon. Iran's IRGC Navy has been training this doctrine in the Strait of Hormuz since the early 2000s. They have an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 fast attack boats. Many carry shoulder-fired rockets, recoilless rifles, or single-tube launchers for the Nasr-1 anti-ship missile. Nasr-1 is an active radar homing missile derived from the Chinese C-704 family. Its 150-kilogram warhead is enough to disable, if not sink, a destroyer-sized vessel, and it can be fired from a flatbed truck or a converted fishing boat. The Houthis already use a copy of this weapon called the Mandeb II, which they have repeatedly launched at coalition warships. So the threat is not just speedboats, it's a layered, distributed system designed specifically to overwhelm a high-end naval task force. And the Houthis have already proven the doctrine works. In March 2024, the bulk carrier True Confidence was struck and abandoned, 3 crew killed. In July, the tanker Sunyan took repeated hits, caught fire, and drifted for days before salvage. The Houthis didn't need to win every engagement, they just needed shipping companies to do the math on insurance. By the end of 2024, container traffic through the Suez Canal had collapsed by roughly 90% compared to pre-crisis levels. The Suez Canal's annual revenue dropped from $9.4 billion to $7.2 billion in a single fiscal year. Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, Evergreen, every major container carrier rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds roughly 4,000 nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to every Asia-Europe sailing. The ripple effects are global. By March 2024, more than 2,000 ships had been diverted from their normal routes. Freight rates between Shanghai and Rotterdam jumped 7-fold at the peak and remained roughly 80% above pre-crisis through 2025. JP Morgan estimated the disruption would add 0.7 percentage points to global core goods inflation in the first half of 2024 alone. The Israeli port of Eilat, 85% dependent on Red Sea traffic, filed for bankruptcy in July 2024 and ceased operations a year later. None of this is theoretical. This is what asymmetric warfare looks like when the defender can't afford to keep winning, and the cost of the US naval response is staggering. Between October 2023 and January 2025, US Navy ships fired 80 SM-6 missiles in the Red Sea. By the Pentagon's own accounting, that's over $340 million in interceptors to fight an enemy whose entire monthly weapons budget is a fraction of a single SM-6. To understand why this happened, you have to look at how a US destroyer actually defends itself in the Red Sea. The standard loadout on an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is built around a layered defense doctrine. Fire your longest range, most expensive interceptors first. At the top of that stack sits the SM-6, the Navy's most versatile interceptor. Range over 200 nautical miles, capable of intercepting aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and with GPS guidance, surface targets. Per round cost, based on the FY 2024 selected acquisition report, between $4.27 and $4.87 million. At a 50% single-shot kill probability, the figure the Navy uses for planning, you typically allocate 2 rounds per incoming threat. That means a single ballistic missile intercept can cost the Navy nearly $10 million in expendables alone. The next layer down is the Harpoon anti-ship missile, originally a 1977 design. At roughly 1.4 $1.4 to $1.5 million per round, it's cheap by missile standards, but the Harpoon was designed to sink Soviet cruisers. Its 488-pound warhead and active radar seeker are massive overkill against a fiberglass skiff making 50 knots. Below that, you have the Mark 45 5-inch gun. It fires 16 to 20 rounds per minute at ranges out to about 13 nautical miles, depending on ammunition. Effective against a single target, largely ineffective against a 30-boat swarm closing at multiple bearings simultaneously. Then there's the last-ditch Phalanx CIWS, the destroyer's final layer of defense. Phalanx empties its 1,550-round magazine in roughly 20 seconds of sustained fire. After that, reload, which takes a trained crew several minutes. None of these systems are bad, they're just built for a war the Navy isn't currently fighting. The SM-6 was designed for fleet air defense against Soviet bombers and supersonic anti-ship missiles. The Harpoon was designed to sink Slava-class cruisers in a mid-Atlantic engagement. The Mark 45 traces back to a 1968 program. All of these weapons were optimized for high-end naval combat against a peer adversary, not for swatting plywood and outboard motorboats. And this is the fundamental problem. The Navy's offensive inventory is calibrated for a war with China. The threat it's actually engaging is closer to insurgency. In one widely reported incident in early 2024, US ships engaged Houthi drones costing roughly $2,000 each, with SM-2 missiles costing around $2 million, a 1,000-to-1 cost ratio. Sustainable for a week, not sustainable for a decade. The CSIS think tank has called this the cost exchange dilemma, the central economic problem of modern naval defense. You can defend your ship with cheaper short-range weapons like Phalanx, but only by letting the threat get within a mile of a $2 billion vessel with 300 sailors aboard. Or you can intercept further out with longer-range, more expensive missiles and slowly drain your magazine into a sea of cheap targets. What's missing is the middle, a cheap, long-range, persistent way to attack the boats before they ever close the destroyer. The Navy has tried to fill that middle with what it already has aboard, the MH-60R Seahawk. Every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries 1 or 2 Seahawks in its hangar. The MH-60R is a magnificent aircraft, but it was designed primarily for anti-submarine and anti-surface warfare against single high-value targets. Its primary payload against surface threats, 4 to 8 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles depending on configuration. Each Hellfire costs roughly $150,000. Much better economics than an SM-6, but the magazine is shallow. Against a single fast attack craft, the Seahawk is lethal. Against a coordinated swarm of 50 boats, it runs out of weapons in 3 minutes. Then it has to fly back to the ship, hot pit refuel, and reload, which takes between 45 minutes and over an hour. A Seahawk's on-station time without refueling is roughly 90 minutes, and that drops sharply when it's hauling a full weapons load. Top speed is 140 to 180 knots depending on conditions. Useful for ASW, slow for a chase across the Bab al-Mandab. The MH-60R can solve a 1-boat problem. It cannot solve a 30-boat problem. What you need is something with greater payload, greater speed, greater persistence, and built around a gun that can chew through a swarm without ever firing a missile. The other option in the carrier air wing is the FA-18E/F Super Hornet, and on paper, the Super Hornet looks ideal. Multi-role, supersonic, deep magazine of bombs and missiles. But the Super Hornet was built for high-altitude, high-speed interdiction, not for hunting 30-knot boats at 50 feet above the water. Its swept wing is optimized for high subsonic and transonic cruise. At the low speeds needed to track and engage small surface targets, lift falls off and fuel burn climbs. The Super Hornet's effective loiter speed is roughly 300 knots, and even then, its endurance over a target area is limited to about an hour without aerial refueling. Its M61 Vulcan cannon carries only about 412 rounds, a few seconds of sustained fire. The cost per flight hour for an FA-18E exceeds $20,000 according to GAO data, compared to roughly $6,000 for an A-10. And every Super Hornet sortie eats into the carrier's already limited combat air cycle. Visual identification matters here. A swept-wing jet flying at 400 knots has a window of seconds to confirm whether a boat is a fishing dhow, a smuggler, or a Houthi launch platform. The geometry of the Bab al-Mandab is brutal. The strait is roughly 26 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Trying to engage low and slow targets with a high and fast aircraft is a recipe for missed shots and wasted sorties. Which brings us to the airframe that may already be the most cost-effective answer to the swarm problem. The A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog has been on the Air Force chopping block for over a decade, but its design philosophy was built around exactly the kind of problem the Navy is now drowning in. Slow, low, persistent, and built around a gun, not built around a missile. The heart of the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm 7-barrel rotary cannon firing depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. The aircraft carries 1,150 rounds. That's roughly 17 seconds of total trigger time. Each PGU-14 armor-piercing round costs the Air Force around $30. A full 70-round burst, enough to destroy any small surface vessel, costs less than $10,000 in ammunition. Add to that 2 engine pylons capable of carrying a AGM-65 Maverick missiles, typically up to 6 on a maritime profile. The Mavericks TV or imaging infrared seeker is purpose-built to discriminate between a fishing trawler and an armed combatant at standoff range. The A-10 straight wing is the unsung hero here. Straight wings generate maximum lift at low speeds, which means tighter turns and longer loiter. In practice, that translates to a patrol speed around 300 knots, on station time of roughly 2.5 hours with external fuel tanks, and the ability to bank inside a 6 nautical mile combat corridor. A swept-wing jet trying to do the same thing burns through fuel and has to fly wider, longer circuits, exposing it to more shore-based threats. The A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit can absorb hits from up to 23mm rounds and keep flying, critical when you're operating at altitudes where small arms fire is a real threat. And critically, the A-10 pilot can visually identify a target. A 300-knot pass at 1,000 feet gives the pilot 30 to 60 seconds to confirm rocket launchers, military paint schemes, or hostile actions before committing. That visual ID matters. In one of the most cited near misses of the Red Sea campaign, US forces narrowly avoided striking a civilian fishing vessel mistaken for a Houthi launch platform. An A-10 going slow gets that ID right. A Super Hornet at 400 knots probably doesn't, and it has been done before. Air Force A-10s were used to engage Iranian small boats during the 1988 Operation Praying Mantis. Same problem, same airframe, decades earlier. Let's do the math. A single SM-6 intercept of a small surface target, roughly $4.5 million. A single A-10 strafing run with 70 rounds of 30mm, enough to render any unarmed speedboat combat ineffective, under $10,000 in ammunition. That's a 500 to 1 cost ratio in the Navy's favor. Even when you include the aircraft's operating cost, roughly $6,000 per flight hour, and a Maverick missile or two for the harder targets, the math still doesn't come close. More importantly, an A-10 squadron based at a regional partner airfield can fly multiple sorties per day, with each aircraft carrying enough ammunition to engage 15 separate targets. That's a level of magazine depth a destroyer simply does not have. An Arleigh Burke carries 96 vertical launch cells. Those cells are loaded once in port. Once spent, the ship has to leave the engagement to reload. An A-10 reloads in roughly 25 minutes on the ground. That difference compounds over weeks of operations. This isn't a hypothetical. The A-10 fleet still has roughly 220 airframes in service as of 2025, with sustainable spares and trained pilots. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona has dozens more in flyable storage boneyard aircraft that could be returned to service. The infrastructure exists, the pilots exist, the doctrine has to catch up. None of this means the A-10 replaces the SM-6 or the Aegis combat system. It doesn't. Long-range ballistic missile defense, area air defense against cruise missiles, blue water sea control, those are jobs only a destroyer can do. But against a saturating swarm of fast attack craft, the A-10 plugs the cheapest, most obvious gap in the US military's anti-surface portfolio. Joint Air Force-Navy integration is not exotic. It has been done for 60 years. During the 1991 Gulf War, A-10s flew anti-surface missions against Iraqi patrol boats from forward airfields. They achieved kills with cannon and Maverick combinations. The same concept applied to the Red Sea or the Strait of Hormuz. Operating from Djibouti or Bahrain would dramatically shift the cost exchange ratio. More importantly, it would preserve the destroyer's expensive interceptors for the threats they were actually designed to defeat: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hostile aircraft. The strategic picture matters here. China is watching this campaign carefully. If the US Navy can be slow-bled by an irregular force armed with imported Iranian missiles and 1980s-era patrol boats, the lessons for a Taiwan contingency are obvious. The PLA Navy strategy in any conflict with the US depends partly on saturation, overwhelming American magazine depth with cheaper, more numerous weapons. Every SM-6 fired at a Houthi drone is one fewer SM-6 available for a Chinese DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile. The Houthis aren't the strategic problem, they're the warning sign. The real question isn't whether the A-10 specifically should be transferred to a maritime role. That's a tactical detail. The real question is whether the Navy can adapt its inventory faster than its adversaries can scale low-cost threats. Because right now, the cost curve is going the wrong way. The Pentagon's response so far has been to study the problem. The Houthis' response has been to fire 150 missiles. In any long war, the side with the cheaper, faster magazine eventually wins, period. So whether the answer is the A-10 or a new low-cost cruise missile, or unmanned surface vessels, or directed energy weapons, the one thing the US Navy cannot afford to keep doing is what it's doing right now. Because at $4.5 million per shot, time is the one thing the budget cannot buy back.